started. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our virtual brown bag series hosted by ASPA's section on science and technology in government. My name is Michael An. I'm an associate professor of public policy at University of Massachusetts, Boston. I'm the current chair of the section. Today, I'm continuing an excellent webinar we started last month with Drs. Holzer and Manoharan. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Jason Anastasopolous speaking about AI algorithmic bias. As you know, I assume you're interested in technologies. AI has received much attention in the media and in academia lately with the rise of machine learning, big data analytics, and reinforced learning, and possibly because of visibility by AlphaGo. And AI technology actually is not necessarily new, as it's been in development for, since like 1950s. And it has been used in government relatively more extensively than people normally would think. And one important area of inquiry that emerged in AI field is the question of ethics and algorithmic bias, and can algorithms make morally sounding decisions? And this actually ultimately is a question of can AI become capable of making value judgment and value choice and ethical choices, and do so in government. So today we'll hear some aspects of this from Dr. Anastasopolous. And today we have a moderator. Today's moderator is one of the STIG executive officer, Dr. Gregory Porumbescu. He's an associate professor at Rutgers University, and he will introduce our speaker and facilitate the Q&A sessions. And just before I go, a few announcements. First of all, use the Zoom hand if you have any questions or comments, and the moderator will call you to speak. And then refrain from speaking or asking questions until the presentation is over today. We just have a 15 minutes or so presentation time. And also, this session is recorded and will be posted on our Facebook later on, so that you know. And also, we are working on our next webinar series, so stay tuned. So with that, I'll turn the podium to Dr. Porumbescu.
Okay, great, thanks, Michael. And I'll just note, I'm an assistant professor, not yet associate. But I see a lot of friendly, names, I guess. Sukumar, Anna, Erna, hi, how are you guys? Thanks for attending. And Jason, thank you very much for agreeing to present, especially at this time in the semester. I don't want to take up too much time because, as Michael said, we only have an hour. But for those of you who don't know, Jason is a very, very smart guy who does a lot of work at the intersection of public management and technology. His bio has it that his research and teaching focuses on the political economy of technology, behavioral public administration, and statistical methodology, with a focus on causal inference and machine learning. Jason did his doctoral work at Cal Berkeley, and he has received a number of awards and grants. He's had visiting appointments at Princeton, Emory, UC Berkeley, and Harvard. And he's been pretty widely published in really, really top journals, including the American Political Science Review, Political Analysis, PAR, JPAR, Electoral Studies, and American Politics Research. A lot of this work dealing with either sort of explanations of how to apply various computational forms of computational text analysis to public management issues, or issues in political science as well. So with that, we'll let Jason take over. And once he's done, I guess after about 30-40 minutes, if you can, aim for those guideposts, we will open it up to Q&A. You can raise your hand, or if you'd like, you can just post your question in the chat room and I'll read it there. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg, and thanks so much, Michael, for inviting me. I hope everyone finds this presentation interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your comments about some of the work that I'm doing. This is part of a bigger research agenda that I'm pursuing, and there's going to be a lot of projects that come out of this. So any thoughts would be really greatly appreciated. So let me just start the presentation. I kind of made this, the presentation is going to focus on a specific piece of research that I'm doing, but I kind of wanted people to get a bigger perspective regarding what is going on here with some of the research I'm doing, and what kind of what some of the technologies such as artificial intelligence really hold for the future of not just government, but for human behavior more generally. So the title of the presentation is called Artificial Intelligence and Human Behavior in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that fourth industrial revolution is, and why it's so important to understand the context of some of these technologies and their interaction with human behavior. So in a 2014 article, Klaus Schwab, who is the head of the founder of the World Economic Forum, which is a kind of conglomerate of a variety of companies, had mentioned in his article that we stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. Now, this was, of course, 6 years ago. And this is where he introduced his concept of the fourth industrial revolution. And the first industrial revolution, this article he mentions, was when water and steam power were used to mechanize production. So this is really kind of the beginnings of the industrial revolution, when we started seeing the steam engine take off and automate production. The second industrial revolution came about roughly 100 years after that, where electric power was allowing for mass production, basically scaled up version of steam power. And of course, we all know that electricity had changed the world in many ways. This is actually a picture from a World's Fair. And a lot of these World's Fairs had been held to show the kind of glory of electricity and what humanity was moving into in the future. Now, the third industrial revolution, he claims, was a revolution of automation, in which people were able to automate production through the use of robots, and that's kind of recently we've had the third industrial revolution, maybe up from the 80s and 90s, where you have plants like the Lexus plant, very famous example, in which there's completely automated production with no people working on the factory floor. But the fourth industrial revolution, which is what I'm going to be addressing today, is a little bit different. The fourth industrial revolution is not really a revolution of hardware. It's more a revolution of software and of networking. And in the fourth industrial revolution, this is where artificial intelligence becomes really important, because in this revolution, it's a revolution of the connections between technologies and the kind of decision making that the people behind these technologies make, and that the technologies themselves automatically make. So there's this he calls it the blurring the line between digital and biological spheres. And you can see here, this picture represents a kind of diagram of the Internet of Things, how all of these things within a city, human beings, buildings, automobiles, public transportation, so on, these are all connected through a gigantic network. So with this fourth industrial revolution comes I would say, unprecedented governance and security challenges. And they're really unprecedented in the sense that historically they've never really happened, right? And so this is the kind of thing so we don't really know what the future holds, and what these great technologies, how they will shape the future. But we do know that there are some issues that we need to kind of think about in order to better address what the future holds for us. So the first, which is the focus of my research, is the interaction between human behavior and artificial intelligence. And these introduce some new governance and security challenges that I'll be talking about. And there are some other major problems, such as hacked Internet of Things devices and new abilities to detect and control security threats, right? And these are all security challenges, but these all kind of really center on this issue related to human AI interactions, and I'll explain why in a second. So as an example of some of these unprecedented challenges, we have, and actually, since the last time that I updated these slides, there was another hack in which, so this is a company, a cybersecurity company called FireEye, and this was hacked by a foreign government. And what FireEye does is it creates a, I guess you can call it a set of protocols which allows government agencies to defend against hackers, ironically, right? So if this, so with this particular company hacked, whoever the hacker was is basically able to know the strategies that government agencies are using to protect their systems, right? And the interesting thing about this hack, and there was also called the Solarwinds hack, which is similar, is that most of these hacks come about because of human behavior, because of phishing scams and things like that, because there's some algorithm at the other end in which is telling a human being to give the access to some individual on the other end who's using an algorithm to kind of manipulate that individual, right? So so human behavior and AI interactions have really extremely important security implications, and this is just one example. And there's also another important implication, and that, of course, is the perpetuation of biases and of injustices. And so or injustice in general. So one thing that we're seeing, and this is more the focus of my presentation today, is that algorithms, artificial intelligence algorithms, which are making decisions in predictive policing contexts, and in other law enforcement contexts, tend to have some of the same biases that people have when it comes to that human beings have when it comes to racial bias and misclassification of individuals on the basis of shallow characteristics, such as, or not shallow characteristics, but characteristics that should not be connected to kind of underlying risk behavior, right? Which is basically racial bias. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this area, and the study that I'm going to talk about is called Administrative Decisions and Machine Predictions. And the whole point of the study is to kind of understand how artificial intelligence technologies and human beings interact to produce certain types of outcomes. So before I start with the discussion of the paper, I'd like to motivate this. And I know people who have seen me present have probably seen this example several times. So I apologize to you for for giving you this example again. But I think it's hopefully it's interesting for those of you who haven't seen this. So to motivate the study, imagine we have a tale of two arrests, and these are people who were actually arrested in Broward County, Florida. On the left-hand side is Vernon Prater, who was caught shoplifting about $86 worth of tools from the Home Depot. And on the right-hand side, we have Brescia Borden, who had was caught stealing a unlocked bicycle and a scooter, and she was arrested for that. Now, Prater was a pretty seasoned criminal, in the sense that he had a lot of prior offenses. He had 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery. And he also had a kind of grand theft auto offense, which was committed after he was arrested for this particular charge. Brescia, on the other hand, had some minor prior offenses, juvenile misdemeanors, and she ended up not committing any subsequent offenses in the 2 years following her arrest here. Now, as it turns out, a risk prediction system, which was created by a company called Northpoint, had predicted that Vernon was a very low risk at roughly a 3 out of 10, risk scale, and while Brescia was a very high risk. And the way in which the North Point system, which we can call an AI system, it's really more like regression, but AI works in many ways like a regression kind of prediction system in certain instances. Uses data from other individuals who've been arrested and then makes a prediction regarding whether they are likely to commit a crime in the future, and then assigns a risk score on that basis. So in this particular instance, Vernon was assigned a low risk score, and Brescia was assigned a high risk score. Now, as I mentioned before, we saw that Prater actually reoffended. And not only did he reoffend, grand theft auto is a pretty big offense. So he reoffended at with a very kind of a much more elevated offense, whereas Brescia did not reoffend at all. So now, of course, this is an anecdotal example. So you might think, well, okay, so that's just one case. Oh, every type of prediction system has errors, which is true. But sometimes the errors favor certain groups of people over others. And there's a variety of reasons for this, which I won't go into in this talk, but I'm happy to talk about in the questions. But this kind of, let's say, discriminatory classification by North Point system in particular, and by many other machine learning algorithms who predict recidivism risk, is commonly disfavors African Americans. So if we think about it from a normative perspective, what are we most concerned with when we think about errors in algorithmic prediction systems that are predicting recidivism risk? Well, we would be most concerned with predicting that someone is a high risk when they're not, right? Because if that's the case, then, from a kind of civil rights perspective, then we're, if we have groups of people who are predicted to be high risk, but they're not, they're going to be treated very unjustly by the criminal justice system, which is going to perpetuate biases and injustices. And it just creates this very awful negative feedback loop where they're going to continue to be labeled as high risk, but even though they're not, and there's actually very little that you can do to argue against these risk scores. And there's an interesting case from Wisconsin in which, basically the defendant lost. He was not able to successfully argue against the high risk label that was assigned to him, which had affected things like his parole and all kinds of bad stuff that really destroyed his life. So the interesting thing that we see here, and the sad thing that we see, is that this higher false positive rate, the falsely labeling an offender as being a high risk, is much higher among African Americans than whites, right? So I'm looking here at the first row, and so we see for African Americans, about 44.9% were labeled high risk but didn't reoffend. That's almost half, right? So almost half of African Americans were labeled high risk but did not reoffend. And so now these people who are labeled as high risk, they are harmed throughout their life, right? And the criminal justice system treats them very differently than people who are labeled low risk. On the other hand, if you look at whites, that rate is still quite high, but it's significantly lower than African Americans. It's 23.5%. So you could clearly say that there's a problem, at least in terms of this system, and there's evidence within many other systems where this is the case, that there's some kind of algorithmic bias which can harm different groups of people, right? Specifically African Americans who have been historically harmed by the criminal justice system. However, in computer science, they tend to focus on this source of bias here, right? They focus on the bias created by algorithms from the data that they use to make predictions. However, the one thing that computer scientists don't tend to take into account is who are the people that are using the data, right? Or are using the predictions to make decisions. I mean, it's bad enough that the algorithms themselves are biased, but what about at the, the end user is that we don't have an automated sentencing system thus far. Maybe we will in the future. But at this point, there are end users of these predictions, and those end users are judges, they're parole officers, they're a variety of people in the criminal justice system, right? They are state actors, they are, administrators who have to interpret the information and they have to make a decision on the basis of it. So what I'm interested in this study that I'm going to talk about is how does the interaction between these AI biases or these prediction biases produced by AI systems and some of the cognitive biases that exist in all of us, how do they combine to shape policy outcomes and decisions? And you could imagine that, other than the criminal justice scenario, there's a lot of examples of where this might, matter a great deal. Now with criminal justice, it matters more in a long run sense, but with security issues, it matters in a very short term sense, because the kind of combining AI biases and human biases can result in disastrous consequences. So for instance, let's say perhaps in the military intelligence, younger officials tend to rely more heavily on algorithmic predictions to make decisions, right? If that's the case, now remember in military intelligence, you have on the ground intelligence and you have intelligence, you have a kind of risk scores and things like that produced from data that algorithms will generate. So now those risk scores or that algorithmic information can be relatively easily manipulated by actors who want to harm the nation that is currently collecting the intelligence. So if younger military officials rely more heavily on these predictions, that could potentially have I say avoidable catastrophic consequences, because those systems can be manipulated to a certain extent, right? And now, on the other hand, you might have older, let's say if you have, again, this is all hypothetical, right? This is just demonstrating how individual characteristics can interact with algorithmic predictions. On the other hand, if you have older individuals who are part of the military intelligence apparatus, they may completely discount algorithmic predictions. They don't really understand them. And they might rely more on their kind of on the ground intelligence. And that on the one hand allows them to, it allows them to circumvent this issue of algorithmic manipulation to some extent, but it also presents a strategic disadvantage, right? Because there are other nations that will be using algorithmic predictions to their advantage, and so it puts them at a disadvantage. So this is a security example where kind of human characteristics and algorithmic predictions can really have very important consequences. Now here in the criminal justice system, algorithmic predictions will have, at least in this particular case, the argument that we're making is that these predictions can interact with someone's characteristics such as their ethnic group, and they can amplify things like confirmation bias and discrimination, right? That we've already seen from the algorithmic systems themselves, and we've seen historically within the criminal justice system. So the effect of this is that you can potentially perpetuate or even increase ethnic and racial discrimination and injustices through these negative feedback loops when you have individuals who are perhaps biased in some way combined with algorithmic systems that are biased, creating the situation where again, these negative feedback loops just keep perpetuating historical injustices that we've seen in the past, right? So the broader question for this project is, how do individual traits and biases affect how algorithmic information is processed? And in this particular study, which I'm going to talk about, I keep saying I'm going to talk about it, and I promise I'll get to it, is how does group identity in particular, so specifically we're using racial identity, influence how algorithmic information is processed. So this is a very basic level, it's kind of basic level question where we're trying to figure out how is it that, my ethnic identity, my racial identity affects the way in which I view this kind of algorithmic information when I'm judging other people in a criminal justice context, right? So the context is that what we're doing in this paper is we're simulating risk assessments made by judges and parole officers, and that's the experiment that we're doing. So we actually ask a group of people to make a risk assessment of real criminal profiles with or without algorithmic information. And then we ask them to predict whether a person will commit a crime again, the recidivism risk. Now, of course, a problem with this is that the people who participated in our experiment, they are not working they don't have experience in the criminal justice system, right? These are just kind of respondents from a wide kind of variety of occupations. But nevertheless, it gives us a sense of how these kind of traits interact. And so the recidivism risk is predicted using an actual machine learning algorithm, and I'll explain how that worked in a second. So when these human decision makers are exposed to this profile information with the risk score, how does it actually affect our outcome variable is how it affects their ability to predict whether someone is really a risk or not. So let me explain how this works, right? And the hypotheses are that when someone is of the same ethnic group, when they're co-ethnic, they'll rely less on the risk score and more on the information shown. But when they're of a different ethnic group, they'll rely more on the algorithm, right? That's because there's a literature on in-group and out-group distrust. And we expect that the risk score itself will actually change how people make decisions. So let me describe how we set up this study. So originally we had data on 5,000 profiles of people who have been arrested in Broward County, Florida. Now we had a lot of information from these individuals. We had images, we had demographic information. And so you could think of all of those things in a way as like on the independent variable side, right? Now, the thing that we wanted to predict, that we sought to predict with a machine learning algorithm called the random forest algorithm, is whether a person, so that would be like the dependent variable, whether a person was arrested on a subsequent charge. So you could imagine that, someone's arrested in 2018, okay? And we have all the information that was collected about them when they were arrested in 2018. And then there's and then 2 years later, we have an outcome variable, which lets us know whether someone had committed a crime again in 2020. And the goal of we generated a series of risk scores using that information collected from 2018 to predict whether someone had committed a crime in 2020, whether they were a recidivist again, okay? And so that risk score produced by the algorithm was shown to subjects, and we sought to understand how that altered their decision making when they viewed a profile. So to do this, we conducted an experiment, and in this experiment, there was roughly 1,200 people, and we had a total of 3 treatments. In the first treatment, we just showed some information that was actually used to train the algorithm. This was information that was used to generate the risk score, right? And we showed individuals who participated just the profile, and we asked them to, judge whether they thought someone would commit a crime again or not within the next 2 years. So that's the control. Then the first treatment is we have the same profile, but with a true risk score generated by this machine learning algorithm, which we call Pi. And that's to assess how the true correct algorithm affects decision making. And then we have another treatment, which is the misleading risk score. And that's just literally the inverse of the true risk score. That was all generated by the score that I mentioned here in the first treatment. And the purpose of including the misleading risk score is to try to figure out the extent to which, again, how the extent to which people are relying on these algorithms, even when the algorithms themselves are telling them information that are contrary to what would be, they're contrary to what is correct in the profile, right? So it's basically giving us a sense of how much are, how much, to what extent are people ignoring the information in front of their eyes and relying on an algorithm, right? And we have two types of profiles that our respondents saw, and those were white and African-American profiles, which, and the way that we selected these profiles, they had roughly the same predicted recidivism risk. Okay, so these are similar people in many ways, except one group was African-American and one was white. So the control would look something like this. There was actually no picture here, but this gives you an example of what one of the profiles that would have been created are. And you see we have, here we have name, we included race, of course. And so all of this information was actually used to generate the risk score. And so, if you were taking the experiment, if you're doing the experiment, you would have maybe seen something like this. And then you maybe would have seen like 10 of these. And then we would have asked you, well, for each of these individuals, can you make a prediction about whether they had, whether you think they committed a crime 2 years later. So that was the control. In the first treatment, we have all the same information and then the true risk score, right? Which is included in the top right-hand corner in this case. So if you receive this treatment, again, you would see this info with the risk score, and then you'd be asked to judge whether someone was a recidivist or not. And then if you receive the other treatment, you would just have the inverse of that risk score. So you can see it's 90% here. That's the true risk score based on the information contained within the profile. And here there's the inverse risk score, which the inverse risk score will contradict the information in the profile, right? So it really gives us a sense of how much, to their detriment, people are relying on erroneous information contained within the kind of algorithmic prediction. Okay, and then the outcome measures, as I mentioned before, are, recidivism prediction. So the first thing is, the question that we asked respondents was, do you think that this person is likely to be arrested in the future? And then there's once we get those predictions, we can calculate a whole bunch of different kind of performance measures, accuracy, precision, recall, between the people themselves, the individuals taking the survey, and then compare them with the machine learning algorithm, and between treatment groups and so on. And the second thing, which I think is more interesting, in my opinion, is the decision justification. So, for every single person that we had surveyed, we asked them not only to predict whether someone's going to be recidivist or not, we asked them to predict we asked them to justify why they thought the person that they made a prediction for was either going to be a recidivist or was not going to be a recidivist. So, and those are all textual responses, and we really hope to learn a lot about, whether our hypothesis about relying on algorithms is correct when we see the textual information supporting it or not supporting it. So we have some initial results from this experiment, and this is something that we're trying to get out soon. And so the outcome here is the proportion of type 1 errors. So type 1 errors in this case are that a individual who participated in the experiment, they predicted that someone was a recidivist when they actually were not. And so that's just each of these distributions represents the kind of proportion of people within each treatment group divided by race. So let me just go over what some of our findings were, because the interesting finding here is this difference, which was statistically significant. So we can see that so the boxes here indicate white stimulus with no score, okay, and then these are both white stimulus with no score. So in other words, among Caucasian respondents, right, this would be a Caucasian judging another group of Caucasians, right? Now the diamonds are African American stimulus with score and without score, okay? So this would, in this case, right, this would be the type 1 error rate for Caucasian respondents judging African American criminal justice profiles, right, with and without a score. So let's take a look first at this part here, where Caucasian respondents are judging white, criminal profiles and non-white criminal and African American criminal profiles. So we can see here that it looks like for when Caucasians are judging Caucasians. Now remember, lower numbers are better here, right? So lower type 1 errors basically mean that there were that people were making better predictions about whether someone was truly a recidivist or not in the future, right? So one thing among Caucasians is that when Caucasians are judging Caucasians, we can see that the score really doesn't make that much of a difference. I mean, there's kind of a decrease here in the type 1 error rate, but it's not statistically significant. Similarly, if we look at African American respondents here, and we look at when African Americans judge African Americans, right, we don't really see any difference, right, in the type 1 error rates. They roughly stay. Whether someone has an algorithmic score or not, when they're co-ethnic, it doesn't really seem to change anything about the way that they make decisions, at least according to these initial results. However, when we go to non-co-ethnic, so Caucasians judging African Americans and African Americans judging Caucasians, then we start to see some interesting results. So among Caucasian respondents, when they're making judgments about African Americans, so in this box would be African Americans with no score and African Americans with score, right? So again, these are the kind of criminal justice profiles. Caucasian respondents, type 1 error rates actually increased. Now, when I say with score, this is the correct score, right? This is not the misleading score. This is just one treatment. So we see that the type 1 error rates actually increase when Caucasians are judging co-ethnics, although that's not statistically significant. So I don't really know what to make of that so far. But I think the really interesting result here is when we take a look at African American respondents who are making judgments about Caucasians, when a score is included, that would be this box here, the type 1 error rate goes down significantly, and this is statistically significant because, and there's a number of reasons why this might be, but we are hypothesizing that, it's because the African American respondents are now relying more heavily on the algorithmic information itself, rather than the full profile, to make a judgment about each of these individuals. And, this error rate is kind of coming closer to the error rate of the actual algorithm itself. So for now, the initial results suggest that, at least among African Americans, when an individual from one racial group is judging an individual from another racial group, that would be non-co-ethnic, they seem to rely more on the algorithmic outputs rather than other information available to them. But when they're judging the co-ethnic, a person of their same racial group, they seem to rely they seem to be relying less on the algorithmic information, and perhaps, it might be, they might spend more time looking at the profiles. Now, again, these are all hypotheses. I don't know if this is true. We don't know if this is true. That's why we want to look more into the decision justifications to figure out what's going on here. So so some additional analysis that we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the textual justifications, which should yield some interesting results. And of course, we're going to compare the misleading algorithmic information with the correct algorithmic information and see what comes up there. So, there's other types of research in this area that could be done, including military intelligence and cybersecurity, which are most relevant now. That research will involve, of course, how the beliefs of individuals and the personal characteristics, all of the things that we bring to the table, right, as human beings, when we're judging, when we're consumers of AI and algorithmic information, how that affects the way that we make decisions with these algorithms. And that really has very important implications for not just social services and criminal justice, but also for statecraft in general, and for the future of nation states. I would argue. I would even go that far to argue that. So that's basically it. And I look forward to your questions. Sorry if that was a little long-winded. All right. So are there any questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah. So you can. I think we have a small enough group that you could just like.
Yeah.
You just ask your question.
Hello, my name is Yanbing Han. I'm a PhD student from Florida International University, and my question is related to the concept of the AI bias that you do you think the AI really have bias? I think maybe AI may not have a sense of race. I would say AI bias is due to the data, the training data, input data, and the people who trained the AI. It's not, AI itself does not have any bias. So how do you think of this?
Yeah, so no, I completely agree with you. AI doesn't have bias in the sense that we think about bias in terms of intentional discrimination, right? AI has bias in terms of error rates, different rates of error within different subgroups of people. So you can go very abstract with this, right? And in fact, there's a whole interesting field that I teach a class on trying to understand when and where AI will produce disparate outcomes for different groups. So yeah, I mean, I agree. So I agree with you in the sense that AI doesn't have bias in the discriminatory intent in that aspect, because of course all bias within AI, any differential outcomes and error rates, that comes from issues. I mean, there's a number of issues, like where there's a number of areas that could stem from. It could be actual discriminatory decisions made, which are reflected in the training data, but it could also be that people from different groups tend to commit crimes that are more or less easy to make predictions about, right? So, an example would be if whites tend to commit crimes for whatever reason, which are easy to predict, right? Which are easy to predict recidivism for, whereas African Americans tend to commit crimes that are not easy to predict recidivism for, you're going to have different type 1 error rates. You're going to have bias in the way that I had shown it, arising from that, and that's not intentional. So yeah, I mean, bias might be somewhat misleading. It's not intentional. How, in the sense of it doesn't have this human intent aspect. However, the problem is, at the end of the day, the outcomes are kind of the same in some sense, right? And the outcomes are that, if we can call it whatever we want, bias or discriminatory intent. But once we kind of bring that human decision maker in to that process, and we have these different error rates, then we start to get real, like this feedback loop of discrimination and bias as we progress into the future. So yeah, it's a great question and a great point. I agree 100%.
All right, thank you very much.
Hello, I have a question. This is Sue Gardner. So what about the data that go in? How do you know about its integrity? So, I mean, the pictures themselves or the data that go in that determine possible recidivism or whatever other data go in. Can you talk about that, please?
So the integrity of the data itself that we've collected is well, I mean, that's not our so that data actually comes from actual arrests in Broward County, and so in order to say for that data to be valid, there has to be a couple of things that are true. We have to trust that we first have to trust that a person actually committed a crime, right? So that they weren't falsely accused of a crime. So that's actually an area that could be a problem. But there's, there might be ways to account for that, but it's kind of difficult to know, whether that's true or not when we have, without exploring individual scenarios. The other data that we have are, is kind of mostly demographic information, and I would say, quote unquote, hard facts about people, and that is their age, their gender, their race, and so on. So I think the data integrity problem could certainly arise when you're talking about whether someone was falsely arrested at any time in their career, let's say, when they enter this database. Whereas the demographic information, I think, is more it's less easy, it's more difficult to dispute. So now, how, like, in terms of the integrity of that data, the actual arrest data, I think that would require really digging into an audit of some of the cases that might be questionable, and learning more about the real circumstances surrounding them. And I think that that really speaks to the value of qualitative data analysis and case studies. And it's something I would like to see, actually. I think that would be very interesting. But I can't speak personally to the integrity of or the whether those arrests were justifiable. But yeah, it's a great question.
Right, thanks.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Jason, first, my apology for coming late. I have to jump from another meeting and just come to here. I think the presentation is very interesting. I can see that you actually build a very strong micro foundation in how these in-group, out-group, and also beliefs can shape their decision that is supported by algorithm produced by AI. So I kind of just a question for you is really about how the distribution of authority or discretion may come into play. So the scenario we have here is someone assigning, kind of making assessment, but would that be different if, say, a judge is doing it versus just ordinary person without that authority to do it? That's one. And second is how much automation is involved. When I say authority, is that machine making a final decision, or there's a human intervention, and the degrees of that, how would that shape the final outcome? So just kind of two questions there.
Yeah, I think those are some great questions. So I think the question of discretion is of utmost importance because it determines how important the role of the decision maker is. So I think if you're talking about situations, I mean, in the real world context, if you're talking about situations in which you have a parole officer making a decision on the basis of this information, the latitude that they have is probably significantly diminished because they have far less discretion to make decisions about the individual who they're viewing on the basis of this information. Whereas a judge, of course, has a lot more discretion, as you mentioned. So one interesting thing is that, that I hadn't really considered until now is that the amount of discretion itself can actually affect the reliance on these predictions, because think about it, like if you're just someone who, if you don't have much discretion and you have to review this information to make a decision, but you're subject to a lot of different pressures, as a parole officer might be, then you'd probably just rely more on the algorithms themselves, right? And then so that would just be like, in a way, almost automated decision making. Whereas if you're a judge and you have a lot more latitude to make decisions and you're not really accountable to other people, you might more carefully consider both pieces of information. Let's say, the factual information you have about a case in particular and the risk score. So I think discretion and accountability can both really affect the extent to which people rely on these algorithms. And I'm not really sure how that, my guess is that it would affect the degree to which that they're relied on. And I'm not really sure, how that would shape out in the criminal justice system, but that's certainly a very interesting question. Now, the second question was regarding, could you remind me of the so I addressed the second question first. And what was the first question again? I apologize.
Oh, no, I think you actually addressed my first question already.
Oh, okay.
The second question is really about the level of automation.
Right.
How would that affect? So you answered my discretion question. My second question really about the level of automation. For example, this process is that if human doesn't challenge the decision, then that will be the final decision, versus that the algorithm can only provide recommendation, but it cannot make any decisions. How much has been automated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the extent to which these decisions are automated really depends on the context. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I think ultimately, as a lot will depend upon how an organization is structured. So it comes down to management and organization. So I'll give you an example, right? Like, let's say you have a predictive policing system, which is designed to use AI to make predictions about where crime hotspots might be. Now, as a police chief, you could decide to either send people there every time you see a prediction generated that this is a high crime area. So you could make it. You could rely entirely. You could imagine that a higher level official relies entirely on the algorithm itself, or on an algorithmic system to kind of manage their police force, or you could, that person could rely on it partially. So I think a lot of the extent to which these decisions are completely automated will depend really on how a organization's management is structured, and what some of the decisions of the people kind of on top are in terms of the extent to which they're going to rely on those systems. I mean, as far as I could tell, there really aren't. And I'm probably somewhat wrong on this. There might be some exceptions, but as far as I could tell, there aren't any systems in government, at least, in which you have these very important decisions that government officials are making about human beings that are completely automated, right? I think that's there's still that discretion aspect. But again, it could be, you could have a situation in which they are completely automated. I mean, I guess a good, maybe one circumstance where there is complete automation is audits, right? So there's some algorithm in the Internal Revenue Service that it takes the tax returns and then it automatically flags whether someone, is like the likelihood of cheating or on their taxes or something like that. And so that's pretty close to an automated system, because probably the IRS will pursue an audit every time that happens. But it's even that, in that case, even it's still kind of up to the IRS officers to, either pursue or not pursue some of those flagged cases. So yeah, I think we're moving towards a more automated system, but I don't think there's anything, it's not there quite yet.
So I think we have time for one more question, given we're going to wrap up at 1. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I said to raise the Zoom hand and I forgot how to do that. So I raised my physical hand. Thank you very much, Jason. It was really interesting, the topic-wise, also your methodology that you use to do this too. And I know we don't have much time, but I'm just curious, as an expert, do you have any recommendations, advice for the government in addressing data bias? I think the bias could be introduced in 2 ways. Of course, what the data reflects, we can call it data bias, or what the data has. And how the algorithm is formulated, that also could create some kind of bias. And here your finding is interesting in a sense. If someone is judging someone else, or people of other race, they're going to rely more on algorithm. And if the algorithm and the data is biased, the bias will translate in the outcomes too. So there's the initial question of the bias in the data, like the case you've shown in 2 theft cases. The woman was kind of new to the theft scene, but she got the higher risk because of her race, and because of the data on their race was probably higher, and had a higher risk assessment. What should the government do? Is there any way we can address this, given that how the data is looking like and how the algorithm is?
Yeah, so there's a couple of recommendations I would make that I would hope to see. The first is kind of complete transparency when it comes to what kind of data is being used to make predictions about individuals. That's not the case in the criminal justice system now. These companies like North Point, they have these proprietary algorithms where they don't tell you exactly what kind of model they use, that doesn't really make that much of a difference in my opinion, but they don't really tell you what data they use to make the prediction. So they don't tell you what the features of the individuals are that they're using to make predictions. They don't tell you, and they don't tell you a lot of other information about how they design these risk scores. So I think that's a big problem. And I think a solution to that would be, more in-house kind of data analytics people within government. I think that would solve that problem to a large extent, that transparency problem. And then the other recommendation I would make is kind of that goes along with that recommendation to some extent, the transparency recommendation. But that is, there has to be constant kind of audits on as soon as these new scores are being produced, right? I think what we're going to have to see in government, if we want a kind of a fair and transparent government moving forward, as these AI tools become more popular, we really have to see that like every time that some of these scores are updated and people are using them to make decisions, I think we really have to see audits being done to assess the extent to which people are being biased in their decision making, or the extent to which they rely on algorithmic predictions to make those decisions. And there was another kind of recommendation that I had that's kind of slipping my mind. But I think those two, transparency and audits of the decision making processes with these systems are incredibly important. And yeah, so I mean, those would be the 2 major recommendations that I have. I had another one, but it's for some reason it's slipping my mind. I don't know why.
Great.
And of
Thank
course,
you.
I guess, you know, I think data integrity is also something that, you know, should be assessed, right? So.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Okay, so thank you first and foremost to Jason, actually, for the great informative presentation. I think this type of work is really valuable right now, and we need to be having more discussions like these in public management. So you know, great to have this opportunity to learn a little bit about you, about your work, and this important topic. Thank you, everyone, for attending, especially at this time of the year. My connection dropped out because we had this snowstorm. So before it drops out again, I'll drop out and just again, thank you, everyone, for attending. Stay safe and happy holidays if you celebrate.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Jason, thank you, and happy holidays.
Bye-bye.